What's going on, guys? I'm NotoriousDuB. I know it's been a while, but this isn't just another aim training video. If you don't know me, I'm a certified personal trainer, strength and conditioning coach, and I have a minor in sports coaching from Auburn University. I've also been in the FPS community forever. I'm talking earnings on Fortnite, top 400 Valorant, multiple top 10s on kovaaks, and I've had this concept in the back of my head of creating an AIM thesis. It's a series of videos where I take everything I know about the brain, your central nervous system, and your muscles and how they work together to perform skill movements, and apply all of that to aiming, which happens to be a skill movement. And the goal is to peel it back layer by layer, video by video, to build an understanding from the basics of aiming to as complex as I can possibly muster, so you have a full resource no matter what game you're maining at the time to actually improve with. View this video as my abstract. I'm going to cover everything surrounding AIM briefly but thoroughly as possible, starting with the theoretical and scientific and slowly getting more and more tangible, before ending with a specific routine for you to do daily for at least close to optimal improvement. It depends on the person. So welcome to the introduction of my thesis. I'm glad you're here. For my personal definition, I've made aiming a broad term that involves pretty much everything that has to do with reducing your time to kill your enemies. So let's just start with the science of aiming and improving. First of all, aiming in its base form has 3 steps: motor control of eye movement, of hand movement, and processing of visual input. All 3 of which are varying degrees of genetic and developed. Reaction time and hand-eye coordination are both genetically and environmentally determined, but reaction time is more genetic and less developed, while hand-eye coordination is the opposite. It's lightly genetic and mostly developed. There's also a correlation between the two genetically, so if you want to check your genetics, do a reaction time test with below 250 being average and around 215 being one standard deviation point above average, and considered pretty great genetics if you have that reaction time. Now, when it comes to training, this is the super sciencey boring part of it. It all revolves around myelination. The axon is a sender of information that hooks up with the dendrite as the receiver of information to create a neural pathway or a neuron, whatever you want to call it. It's responsible for virtually all functions within your body. That's how it works. From there, myelination happens to perform a protective fatty layer around that neuron as insulation to prevent electric signals from leaking out, and speeds up transmission of information, effectively making you faster and more consistent the more you train it. Now, this is a huge takeaway of this video. Based on current new research, myelination happens predominantly during sleep, which not only stresses the importance of getting enough sleep, but performing your training before bed. Now, this is newer age research, but it's been shown many times now that playing an instrument and performing physical movements before sleep results in noticeable improvements the next day in those aspects. This is due to myelination and memory consolidation that happens during deep sleep. And the most recent thing you've done, hopefully your training, is the freshest memory and neural pathway that needs to be myelinated or consolidated, whichever one you're doing. So how do you actually improve? Well, there's 2 leading principles. They're pretty similar to each other, but they matter in conjunction with one another. You have the zone of proximal development, which is the basic principle for educational psychology. It comes from Vygotsky, and it's based around the gap between what a learner can do independently, what you can do with guidance and or support, and down to what you can't do, period. In essence, it states that the least learning happens in the first and third zone because it's either too difficult or too easy to promote growth and development, and you need to be able to properly challenge yourself and keep yourself in an uncomfortable position that's not entirely foreign inside that second zone. So make your training and practice difficult, annoying even, but not grueling and insurmountable. And then you have progressive overload, which is already everywhere in the weightlifting community, but it spreads to every discipline. And it's the leading training principle that involves gradually increasing the stress placed on the body over time to promote adaptations. And the reason I chose this graphic is to say that there will be dips in performance when you're trying to get better in all aspects of life. You just have to get worse to get better. Trust your training and power through. But this is the principle for promoting muscle efficiency. It's the same principle as training type 2A muscle fibers in sprinters, a basketball player dribbling faster and learning more difficult moves, and a musician gradually learning a more complex piece with a higher tempo. And in terms of speed and time to kill, that's all you're doing with your arm whenever you're aim training. You're clicking dots faster, more efficiently moving to a head, and you're just becoming more efficient and consistent. Hopefully that all makes sense. If I got lost in the sauce or didn't make sense, let me know in the comments. Now let's take it a step further and tangibly create improvement. First of all, you have to peel back the different layers. Every movement and action is made up of a series of movements and actions, which is probably made up of a series of movements and actions. So flying a plane is complicated from the outside in, but breaking it down into like 50 different steps to memorize and perform makes it at least a little more manageable. And the deeper you can peel back the layers to a specific movement, the easier it's going to be to train. So for example, you want to improve at flicking. You should break down the actual mechanic of flicking, which involves visual recognition, shoulder/arm movement, which is the majority of the flick, the wrist movement, which is the micro correction portion when your arm gets you to the location, the visual recognition to then click immediately when the mouse first crests over the target. And depending on your main game, there are probably a million more ways to segment it, but by isolating one specific mechanic to work on, you'll improve faster. That mechanic will be something you can rely on, and by not having to focus on that type of aim, you can use all your brain power on the others. Because multitasking is a myth, you only have so much brain power to assign to each aspect. Hopefully all that made sense. Train one to get better at the other over time. Now, regular training is probably the most important aspect of this whole thing. The average person's central nervous system starts to reach diminishing returns at about 60 minutes of skill training within the proper zone of proximal development. And heavier diminishing returns start to occur at about 90 minutes of training in a given time, which means it's more important to train consistently than get all your hours in at once. And your central nervous system actually will be trained over time to adapt to a higher and higher workload. And by maintaining good recovery practices like good sleep, over time you can actually increase your rate of improvement. And to add on to that, when training, it's very important to maintain confidence and be able to objectively evaluate yourself to be able to understand your strengths, weaknesses, and properly create a training plan for yourself. And every time this topic comes up, I always have to bring up the best skill athlete of all time, Kobe Bryant. And I always talk about Kobe because scientifically, he probably had the best workout regimen of all time for improvement because he does 3 workouts a day and they follow the 3 tiers of training: developing muscle memory, translating that into a game-specific movement, and creating instinctive movement. Kobe used to wake up super early in the morning. That's what he was known for. Train for 2 hours, take a nice long break and rest, train for 2 more hours, and then later on to the evening, he would scrimmage. And the way he would go about this was perfect. The morning practice consisted of mostly form work, set shots, one-handed shots without legs, and basically breaking down his shots and moves into individual parts and practicing it that way. It's very low tax on the central nervous system, but it's heavy on the reinforcement of muscle memory, and it prepares you to have perfect form throughout the rest of your training day. And then the second workout gets into more game-specific movements, where he's catching and shooting, creating shots off the dribble, creating shots he would do in a game. And you end the day with a scrimmage, aka playing the game. That's where you hyper-focus on what you are working on in your training of creating game-specific movements, so you can turn that game-specific movement into an instinctive movement, like flicking into a track, certain movements combined with getting shots off, focusing on headshots, tap firing, burst spraying. You get the picture, but that's where the zone of proximal development comes in. You create the ability to do the movement. Once you're able to do the movement, you make the movement more difficult by incorporating game-specific scenarios to it. And finally, you play the game with your training in mind to instinctively perform it in-game so you can move on to another aspect. But all of this training would be nothing without perfect practice. If Kobe's not too good for form work 25 years into playing basketball, neither are you. This is where calm aim comes into play. This is a huge term that's making waves in the FPS community right now. It's just slowing down your aim to make yourself more consistent and aim for the head more often. This was something talked about since like the early days of CSGO. We just didn't have a cool name for it. In essence, you want your form to have no wasted movement. When you're adjusting your crosshair to a target, you want a completely straight line from point A to point B without deviation from the line and without overshooting the target and having to correct back. And optimally, you probably want to shoot and stop your crosshair on the first pixel of the target's head, but don't practice that. You're over-optimizing. Humans aren't robots yet. And then once you're comfortable with that and you're able to perform that relatively consistently, that's when you want to start speeding up your aim little by little. And honestly, the speeding up will usually happen naturally as you get more efficient with the movement, so I wouldn't press that by any means. So by starting off your aim or going back and making sure you get this down, you have a much more linear aim progression and stop a lot of those plateaus you're going to have along the way by not developing hitches. Combine that perfect form with developing a zone of control and you're well on your way to success. Now, when you go on TikTok, you watch a game highlight, it's probably some crazy movement technique or a long-range flick shot from target to target. It's flashy and awesome, and I'm jealous every time I see them. But watch a pro player from almost any game and you'll realize like a common thread between most of them. Most of their kills are going to come from within a certain range when they see their target. It's called a zone of control. Optimally, you want it to be about the center half of your screen, but it's different for everyone at different skill levels. And the majority of the kills that is possible for you to get in any game are going to come from right inside of this zone. Now, it's great to work on extending your zone by finding scenarios that work on the edges of it, but reducing your time to kill and increasing your consistency within that zone is the key to top level play, even if it's not flashy and it seems boring to you. So about zone of control, whenever we talk about wrist aim versus arm aiming, unless you have an insanely high true sensitivity, you're some combination of a wrist or an arm aimer, where your arm gets your crosshair to the right area and your wrist and fingertips create the precision for the shot. And the goal for your arm is to decrease the flick error over time to give your wrists an easier time to make the shot. And for your wrist and fingertips, it's going to be about being precise, but also learning to work in tandem with your arm so it becomes one in sync movement instead of a flick and a micro adjustment. That's where a lot of the error comes from. So in your training, experiment with your zone of control because it's so heavily skill reliant. But at the base level, to isolate the movements and begin training, longer range flicks should be larger targets and shorter movement shots can be smaller targets. Zone of control is a tough one. If I need to make a video about it by itself, let me know in the comments down below. But that's also why it's largely personal preference, how you grip your mouse and sit in your chair, because everyone is different. But if you want a quick suggestion, some variation of the claw is probably optimal because a palm grip reduces the amount of finesse that your fingertips are going to have. And a true fingertip grip removes your anchor point from your wrist. That creates a lot of consistency. Now let's quickly talk about anticipation before we get to the routine portion. Anticipation is the #1 way to decrease your reaction time, period. If someone snuck in my room right now and threw a basketball at me, I'm probably getting smoked down. But if I hear them walk in, look at them, see the basketball, they throw it, I have a good chance of catching it. Because anticipation decreases reaction time by allowing you to prepare a response before the stimulus is presented. And by anticipating a stimulus, you can improve your decision making because you've already prepped your response. It's all about being proactive instead of reactive. This is actually the entire premise of hitting a baseball. It takes about 400 milliseconds for a 100-mile-an-hour baseball to reach home plate. With a 180 millisecond reaction time, which is really good, it should be roughly impossible for the batter to react to the baseball, time the swing, and get the bat around in the right area in the remaining 220 milliseconds. But anticipation allows it. And if there's any trick to improving immediately at a game, it's anticipating where stimulus is going to come from. You should be doing this already, but if you're not, walk around the map constantly with 1, 2, or 3 different areas you expect to see enemies actively focused on. Practice good crosshair placement based on where you expect the people to be, and relax your eyes. Meaning, you should be looking at specific areas of the screen, but not focusing on them, if that makes sense. Your eyes are always fixated on an area or darting around, but they shouldn't be tunnel visioned. You should be waiting on stimulus to come into one of the areas that you expected, and if someone happens to pop up in an unexpected area, which they will from time to time, then you have to truly rely on your reaction time. Easy fixes all around, you can do that today. Now for the bread and butter. Let's talk about your daily aim training routine. That's what everyone's here for anyway. This is the basic version. Tailor it to your needs. If you don't want to commit as much time, cut the times in half. And if you're already insane with aim and want to focus specifically on game improvement and going pro, move your scrimmage to the end of the day instead. Mandatory for daily routine. I won't get too lost in the sauce, but cardio is the only way we found to prevent cognitive decline. If you want to keep your brain functioning at a high level for life, do at least 30 minutes of cardio, preferably in the morning. And meditation is really the only way we found to increase gray matter in the brain, which helps with learning, memory, concentration, and decision making for about 25 to 30 minutes a day. Just trust me and do those two, but also forget I said anything about those because this is an aim training video. Now you need a 20 to 30 minute warm up that revolves around form movements. If you need any suggestions, they're here. 10 to 20 minutes of straight line to the target without overshooting it or micro adjusting. If you're on kovaaks, hit the reflex medium flick scenario. If you're on Aimlabs, just live on line trace. If you're in game, hit a few death matches and keep it slow and controlled, or just hit the practice range and walk around shooting targets nice, slow, controlled, focusing on shorter flicks with perfect form. Then go 10 to 20 minutes of form tracking. If you're on Aimlabs, hit sphere track. It's relatively slow enough to keep it controlled. If you need to go slower, then do it. On kovaaks, I like smoothness training 60. If you play a game with more verticality, like Apex maybe, find something more suitable, or just hit the practice range and walk around the dummies while keeping your crosshair centered on their head. It seems easy, but it's actually kind of difficult, and you're training in engine, which is usually better anyway. Then you need an improvement program. Focus on 1 to 2 specific things you want to improve on and hit it for like 60 minutes. This is what my kovaak's playlist looks like right now, and I'll just repeat it. It's pretty solid to me for developing and reinforcing great form, developing zone of control, with a minor development on longer flicks. But come up with your own based on your own goals. With that, you've already hit the 60 minutes of improvement mark, and you've already made improvement today. But take that improvement program that you made, the 60-minute one, and do it right before bed so you accelerate your improvement even more, probably over double. With that, you have around 2 hours of game time today, and hopefully you're finding time to actually play the game and have fun, or live life in between. I found that this specific way works a little bit better than the way Kobe trains because gaming doesn't tax your central nervous system nearly as much in my opinion, but if you want to extend the form warm-up into a 60-minute session and forget about the improvement program whenever you wake up, that's another very valid option. Hopefully I kept that simple enough and didn't go too far off the rails. Comment something random down below if you made it this far and just want to show some support like dub or aim or something, and give me some suggestions in the comments if this helped or if you want to know more about any of this stuff. I'll see you guys soon with some Marvel Rivals videos and a ton of science-based stuff. Thank y'all for being here.